Hello and welcome to Rising Clyde, the Scottish Climate Justice Show. I'm Ian Bruce in Glasgow. COP, the United Nations annual meeting to discuss how to confront the climate crisis, is upon us yet again. This time, COP28 is happening in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. That is, I think, the world's seventh biggest exporter of oil. And the president of the COP28 is none other than the president of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. Not surprisingly, that's raised some eyebrows. And what's more, this, of course, comes at the end of what looks like being, or is already, the hottest year ever recorded globally. And it comes on the back of a series of reports, the latest, the emissions gap report from the United Nations Environmental Programme, which points out that pretty well every single world government is way off meeting their own commitments, their own promises in terms of mitigation and cutting emissions. And even if they were to fulfill those promises, which they're way off fulfilling, the world would be heating up by well beyond the 1.5 degree global warming amount, which has been seen as the critical threshold. So what should we expect of COP28? And does it make any difference anyway? To discuss all this, we're very happy to have with us Becky Kenton-Lake. She's the Coalition Manager for Stop Climate Chaos Scotland. That's the main coalition of climate organisations and campaigns and groups here in Scotland. And joining us from Colombia, Nathan Thanki is a veteran of many COPs. He was essential in organising the COP26 coalition when COP26 was here in Glasgow a couple of years ago, and he's now working in Colombia with the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty initiative. Thank you so much to both of you for being with us. Becky, Scottish First Minister Humza Yousaf and his team are heading to Abu Dhabi. The climate movement here in Glasgow is gearing up for the Global Day of Action on the 9th of December. Tell us a little bit about how Scotland's looking at COP28, what the movement, what are the movement's demands and messages ahead of that Global Day of Action on December the 9th.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, it's amazing that it's already been 2 years since the COP26 in Glasgow. I feel like there is still some connection, to the process every year when it comes around now in Scotland. There's definitely still more media interest here, more kind of interest from the climate movement and the community here than there would have been, I think, without us hosting a couple of years ago. So in terms of kind of this year's COP, it feels like there's kind of two really important aspects that people in Scotland are kind of organising around. And the first is obviously the kind of international solidarity aspect. As you've already said, Ian, it's likely to be confirmed that this will be the hottest year ever for the world. We're seeing, increasingly devastating impacts in every corner of the planet. And again, the COP has been hosted in a country where no protest or mobilizations are actually allowed to take place. So it feels like it's more important than ever, as we did in Egypt last year as well, that we come out in Scotland to show international solidarity with the most impacted communities around the world and show that we stand in solidarity with people that are experiencing the most impacts and also aren't able to come out on the streets and add their voice. The second aspect I think that's really relevant to people in Scotland is that we've seen the last few months, rolling back on climate policies by the UK government. We've seen a lack of action over the last few years by the Scottish government, although they're still kind of saying all the right things and they still seem to be having kind of positive intentions. We're just seeing that lack of action and lack of delivery that we need so urgently in this kind of crucial decade for action. So it really feels like there's a lot of concern around, policies being rolled back and the lack of action. And in Scotland, there is a new climate change plan that was due to be published in November, which is a really crucial document that was due to be setting out exactly how Scotland would get on track to meet its legal climate targets across all different sectors. But that has now been delayed until the new year, and it might not even appear until kind of spring 2024. So I think there's a lot of concern around people, and it feels like the 9th of December is a really key moment to come together. We've got national and grassroots organisations all organising together and we'll be coming together on the day. So really looking forward to that being a kind of key moment to bring everyone together and hear from some inspiring speakers and really show that people in Scotland wanting urgent action.
Becky, you mentioned that the Scottish Government's climate plan, new climate plan, the fact that it's been delayed, is that a concern? I mean, is that a worrying sign, or is it just a kind of the way things are?
It is worrying, yeah. When we're in an emergency situation, we know that the Scottish Government themselves have said that this is a decade for delivery, the 2020s, but we're already nearly halfway through that decade, and we're just not seeing the amount of action that we need to reduce emissions in a fair way and deliver a just transition. So although the Scottish Government will probably still be able to deliver the plan within their statutory kind of timeline, it just doesn't show the sort of urgency and the commitment to delivery that we so urgently need to see. So it is worrying, yeah.
Yeah, I think we might come back to some of those points about exactly what's going on with the Scottish Government policy in a moment. But Nathan, we mentioned this question of the emissions gap and these recent reports that show just how far we are off even the relatively modest targets that have been set by previous COPs. Can you unpick that a bit for us? Exactly how far off are we, and what does it mean?
Yeah, I would say that even more interesting than the emissions gap, and even more important to look at, is probably the production gap report. So that's an effort that has been led by the UN Environment Programme over the last number of years, showing the really the massive discrepancy between what countries are going to produce in terms of fossil fuels over the next decades, and what their nationally determined contributions or what their pledges to climate action are. And, they are completely incompatible. The majority of increase in production is planned for North America. I think it's 30% of planned increase between now and 2030. So the remainder of the decade is essentially two countries, Canada and the US. And this absolutely makes a mockery of the multilateral process that the COP is a part of. It's taken 30 years for climate negotiations to even name the biggest cause of climate change, which is fossil fuels. We have a massive challenge to get a global consensus around any kind of useful language about phasing out fossil fuels while at the COP. We know that there are different national contexts and needs. Not every country is in the same situation, but we cannot successfully tackle climate change just by setting emissions goals that are ambitious on paper, but while at the same time we're actually digging up and burning new fossil fuels and licensing new oil, gas, and coal projects. We need a different approach. Momentum is growing for a slightly different approach. That's the initiative that I'm a part of. So there's a lot of excitement now around a new mechanism to complement the Paris Agreement and build intergovernmental cooperation around a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, because we need a plan, an actual global plan to manage a decline and eventual phase out of fossil fuels in a way that is as fast as possible. It has to be fair as well, or it's not going to get off the ground. And part of the fairness is, of course, that it has to be financed. We're pretty clear in our analysis that the UNFCCC might be useful for a number of reasons. There's a lot of fights to be had in that forum. We might touch on some of them later. But as a forum for managing the equitable phase out of fossil fuels, it doesn't seem fit for purpose. We would love to be proved wrong on that, but at present, it looks like we need to complement it with additional measures. We also have this issue of many lobbyists being sent and the corporate capture of the COP space. There's a report released yesterday or the day before showing that over 7,000 fossil fuel lobbyists have attended in the last 20 years. So they are, trying to exert influence, really a kind of a pathetic last gasp of a dying industry to just extract as much profit as possible. The world be damned. So yeah, we feel like there's a number of challenges with engaging the COP that would call into question, whether or not it can deliver. I can get into those, but I feel they're probably pretty familiar for most people. We have a consensus model, so the biggest polluters are inevitably at the table determining what to do. It's the classic case of the fox, being in charge of the chicken coop. And then we have a kind of structural inability within the design of the UNFCCC to focus on emissions as an abstract thing rather than to actually focus on the extraction, so the production of fossil fuels, which leaves room for all manner of loopholes. This is why we're getting all of the increased obsession around fantastical ideas of the scale of carbon capture and storage, even of geoengineering. So what we're seeing is a decoupling basically of fossil fuels from the emissions that fossil fuels and burning them causes. There's many other reasons why we need to phase out from fossil fuels, health challenges, questions around democracy, damage to local community and ecosystems. So it's not only an emissions issue, but even from an emissions issue, we can't decouple emissions from fossil fuel production.
I want to ask a bit more in just a moment, Nathan, about what you think those points that it still is worth fighting for within the COP space. I mean, both of you, I know, will remember very well, that back 2 years ago in Glasgow, I think it was there were many differences, but there was broadly a consensus about that sort of inside-outside kind of strategy. The idea that we needed to mobilize as much as possible outside, but we also needed to kind of have those battles inside and bring those two things together to put as much pressure on. The increasing inability or unwillingness of governments to kind of fulfill their promises seems to kind of reduce the usefulness of that inside thing. So I do want to explore that a bit more, but how does that look from Scotland, Becky? I mean, how does the Scottish government's performance on these things, or non-performance on these things compare, do you think?
Yeah, I think to pick up on something that Nathan just said, it's obviously completely pointless to have strong commitments and make these promises if you're still, agreeing to extract new fossil fuels and keep producing and keep emitting. So, I mean, Scotland, we have had some of the world's most ambitious targets, but other countries are catching up with those, and they're no longer as impressive as they once were because they're not kind of being ratcheted up either. They're kind of stuck at the same levels. We have made some progress in reducing emissions by over 50% since 1990. But again, we've kind of done the easy things, the big wins, and these are kind of the emissions progress we've made has stalled in recent years. We've missed 8 of the last 12 emissions targets, and the government's own advisors have said we're not on track to meet our legally binding target for 2030. So it is concerning. We have been shown some leadership, but we really need to ramp up what we're doing to kind of remain in that position. And the new climate change
plan. Can I just jump in?
Yeah, sure.
Nathan mentioned the presence of the fossil fuel industry lobbyists in the process. Is that something we're feeling the effect of in Scotland and in relation to the Scottish government? Do you think that sort of relationship with the industry and their lobbying?
I think so, yeah. I think it was Friends of the Earth Scotland released a report not so long ago about the presence of fossil fuel lobbyists in the Scottish government and the meetings that they're having with the First Minister and other officials. So I think it is something that we're really concerned about, that level of access they have to the government and the level of influence they have. So we're seeing, potentially the Scottish government are going to be approving a new gas-fired power station at Peterhead. They haven't come out very strongly against the proposed Rosebank oil field just off Shetland. So it is really concerning that they're not kind of taking a stronger stance on this issue.
Nathan, at the center of COP28 was meant to be this global stocktake, and I imagine that will be mentioned quite a bit in the news coverage of COP28. Can you tell us what is the global stocktake, and does it achieve anything, or could it achieve anything?
I can tell you what it's supposed to be, which may be somewhat different than what it ends up being. But essentially, in the Paris Agreement, countries realized that their pledges towards the Paris Agreement, because they had made those in advance of it in 2014, were insufficient, essentially. And so they were more focused on getting the basic structure of the Paris Agreement than on the content, which in any case is nationally determined, meaning It's not set according to science. It's not set according to a global plan to be equitably shared. It's just every country do what you want. So it was kind of inevitable that it would end up being that way. But they tried to get around the problem by creating this global stocktake for 2023, which would be the quote unquote ratchet up mechanism. So an opportunity for countries to come together and assess or take stock of the progress or lack of progress towards the goals of the Paris Agreement, and give some guidance on the next round of NDCs as to, to basically improve them. So many civil society groups have pinned a lot of hope on the global stocktake as a sort of redemption for the process. I fear they will be disappointed. They have and the stocktake is, of course, assessing progress towards all of the goals. So that would be all of the areas of the Paris Agreement, not only mitigation, but also with regards to finance, with regards to adaptation, and with regards to loss and damage and other areas. It's a holistic assessment. But I just want to mention a little bit about what we're hoping that the stocktake can do with regards to fossil fuels as one of the key fights. We really think that they should decide to cease new oil, gas, and coal exploration and development in an equitable way. So with the most wealthy and industrialized countries moving first and fastest, and doing so in a way that actually is in line with the science and with what the IPCC says we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by. And coupled with that, there's a big push for a complementary renewable energy target. There's a number of different targets floating around at the minute. And as always, the devil will be in the detail. Is this a target that is linked to fossil fuels, meaning that it would result in the displacement of fossil fuel? Or is it just a target that would increase overall capacity, which is probably not what we need. We need to address the problem at source. And there's many issues also with mineral extraction related to renewable energy and land rights as well that need to be factored in to that. So, there are issues there. But I think one of the key fights really with the global stocktake isn't actually about any one area, any one thematic area, whether that's fossil fuels or finance. They're all key and they're all contentious. But actually, I would suggest that one of the main challenges is that this question of how do we actually understand our arrival to this point in time. It's both a retrospective exercise as well as a forward-looking one. But in the retrospective part of it, we have a real challenge because we know that the history of climate change doesn't start in 1990 when the UNFCCC is agreed. It starts much earlier with industrial capitalism and sort of even the colonial era being really responsible for a massive spike in emissions that then just has continued since that time. So there's a big fight about how to take stock and how to include historical responsibility within the frame of the global stocktake. And our usual suspect, the United States of America, as the greatest historical polluter, is adamant that that should not be mentioned at all. Unfortunately, the United States was the co-facilitator of basically the process that will feed into this political outcome of the global stocktake in Dubai. So they kind of rigged the input somewhat by really reducing the significance of any mention of historical responsibility, even though all of the input from parties had given this immense priority. We're not going to understand anything about our current position if we don't understand where we've come from, and we're also not going to be able to give any guidance on what we should do in the future that will be acceptable to parties if that also doesn't take into consideration the fact that some countries have polluted a hell of a lot more than others.
Nathan, so let me just get something clear. There seems to be a lot of talk at the moment in the mainstream press and commentators. And I think this partly came out of the meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi Jinping about this sort of tripling renewables by, I can't remember what the target is now. But that idea of tripling the capacity for renewable energy, you don't see as being a kind of particularly useful path. Am I understanding you right?
It depends. Of course, we need to increase renewable energy capacity. The tripling goal is just sort of pulled out of nowhere, whether that, not exactly science-based, but a politically determined figure. Other figures include a 1.5 terawatt increase in capacity annually. The thing with this is really, as I said at the beginning, does this result in a reduction in fossil fuels, or is it just adding renewable energy capacity onto existing and expanding fossil fuel derived supply? So that's the problem that we face. If we're just adding renewable energy onto fossil fuels, we're not going to get anywhere. And similarly, this is a very difficult topic that no one wants to touch with a long pole, but we actually have to reduce essentially energy demand going into the future, while at the same time increasing access to energy, because there's 1 billion people on Earth that don't have access to electricity or don't have adequate access to electricity. So, we're talking in global goals about universal kind of numbers, and it actually doesn't work like that. There will be people that need to dramatically increase their consumption of energy, and there will be people, far fewer, who need to really significantly decrease their consumption. And these are the elites in all of our countries that really overconsume. And it's not, in order to survive, it's in order to really live lives of luxury. And so those energy that's just, meant to help celebrities and the super elites, have more yachts and be really extravagant is not useful. Any extra capacity that we have should be going towards those in the world, of which there are many who need it in order to live dignified lives.
Becky, what role do you think Humza Yousaf and his Scottish government team can, if any, can usefully play in Dubai at COP28? And what kind of demands is the movement putting on them to do there?
Yeah, so Scotland has an interesting role at COPs because it's not an official party to the talks like the UK government or other kind of countries. So we believe that they can play a really helpful role as that non-state actor by kind of championing the cause of the Global South and really kind of pushing ahead on and showing kind of leadership on some of the key issues. So we saw this a couple of years ago at COP26 when Nicola Sturgeon really championed the issue of loss and damage, and the Scottish government then became the first nation to pledge funds. Although they themselves would admit it was a drop in the ocean, it was a really important moment for kind of breaking that logjam and kind of encouraging other countries to act. So we'd really like to see them carry on in that role. The COP process really badly needs, rich polluting countries to lead on some of these topics. But we just have to always say, that there's no way of showing international credibility or leadership if that action isn't backed up with action at home to reduce emissions. So we can't be talking about how great we are on the international stage if we're not meeting our climate targets at home and reducing emissions. So a couple of things that we'd like to see from the Scottish Government at this COP. Just transition is an area that is having increasing profile in the UNFCCC space, and that will be a bigger issue at this year's COP. And we have got a fairly good story to tell on some aspects of just transition in Scotland. We're the first country to, I think, have a just transition commission and a just transition cabinet secretary with that as their remit. So, we have made some progress on this. And so that's the sort of thing that Scotland could be talking about, stretching their ambition on and talking about on the global stage to kind of encourage others to follow suit. Secondly, really wanting Scotland to support the campaign that Nathan's working on the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. If the Scottish Government give it backing to that, it would be a really positive indication that they are looking to fairly kind of transition away from fossil fuels, and supporting that global campaign, I think would be a really powerful step. So that's just a couple of examples of things we're wanting them to be talking about at this year's COP.
Is that feasible? I mean, is it likely or possible? I mean, either of you actually, Nathan or Becky, that the Scottish government, I don't know, would sign up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Pastor Nathan, I don't know if you've got any thoughts.
All things are possible, Ian. Politics is the art of making things even more possible. So I don't see why not. And the strong signal from Scotland, as Becky said, would do wonders, I think, for encouraging others. We have, very few countries in the global north and in Europe in particular that are openly calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. The countries that are doing so are in the global south. So a signal from a global north country would be excellent, even if that country is not a party to the UNFCCC. So yeah, Scotland would be very welcome to make a splash at the COP and follow on from its leadership with regards to loss and damage to a just transition away from fossil fuels.
So maybe we could make that one of the slogans for the Global Day of Action. Might be a bit late by then, Becky, but it certainly be it would be an interesting, concrete thing to demand. Yeah. But tell me, Nathan, tell me a bit more about what the Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative is arguing and trying to get out of COP28 in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, so I said at the start that we don't hold a lot of hope for the COP as a forum. Like, we don't see it as particularly capable of dealing with the issue of an equitable phase out of fossil fuels. But that's not just a position that we have just because. So we are also engaging in it and hoping that it could deliver. I think that if it delivered a recognition on the need to address all fossil fuels, recognition of that production gap report that I already mentioned, and if it recognized the need to address the full life cycle of fossil fuels, including production, transportation, consumption, if it recognized the need to end the expansion, so no new projects, as the first step in a phase out and as a necessary step in keeping to 1.5, if it committed to an equitable phase out of fossil fuels without all of these loopholes and qualifiers of will it be unabated or other false solutions, if there was also a clear link between phase out and these considerations around equity, around the common and differentiated responsibilities that countries have, if the phase out was supported. Like, if we can talk about phase out all day long, but there are many countries that would love to phase out fossil fuels, would love a just transition, but are very economically dependent on fossil fuel income, usually because they export it. Those countries need support, financial and technical and technological support to enact a just transition. A country like Colombia is a country that is literally crying out for that support, has plans for just transition, but cannot do it alone. So COP would need to really elevate that cooperation. And then I think,
Can I just jump in there, Nathan? Because you began to talk earlier about this alternative mechanism, I think, outside of the COP. And maybe could you just, because we're almost out of time, and I'd really like to get that clear. What is the alternative? All right, so that you can do some stuff in COP, but what's the alternative path that you're looking at and proposing there?
We're proposing that countries begin to negotiate a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So that would be, as the name would suggest, taking some inspiration from existing multilateral treaties. In this case, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was also notably kind of championed by civil society, by movements, and then taken up by governments in the UN system. So it can be done again. There's plenty of other examples of such treaties. The plastics treaty that's being currently negotiated is one, but there's also the Montreal Protocol, the Ottawa Convention on the ban of landmines. So there's a number of treaties where a popular campaign has forced governments to come to the table and to begin to agree, the policy to address the issue. In the case of fossil fuels, it's obviously a much harder issue because kind of our whole economy is built around fossil fuels, so it's not as simple as the CFCs or landmines. We don't have a landmine-based economy, although we do have a war-based economy, so it's somewhat similar. And we think that this can actually be done far faster than the consensus model of the UNFCCC, because that requires all 194 parties to be in agreement. We have obviously countries that want to be the last barrel of oil produced. They're not going to, come to the table. So we actually need a group of countries that are willing, that are going to engage, genuinely and ambitiously, for them to be sort of first movers and for them to ride ahead. And that has proven to be a model of treaty creation that has proved successful in the past, where you do have a group of countries that want to lead on an issue, and then they build a consensus and they build it out in layers rather than trying to build out the big container right at the start, which is what we would have to do in the climate convention.
That sounds really challenging, but exciting if it's possible to move in that direction. Becky, just a final comment maybe from you on what you see beyond COP as the priorities.
Yeah, I think in Scotland there's just a lot of huge opportunities coming up to show that the Scottish Government are really going to turn their kind of positive rhetoric on action into actual delivery. So I'd encourage everyone to come along on the 9th of December and kind of join the Global Day of Action in Edinburgh. We're starting at 12:30 outside the Scottish Parliament, and there's going to be lots of opportunities there to add your voice for action. And after that, in the new year, please look out for the new climate change plan and be speaking to your MSP about trying to make sure it's as strong as possible and it actually clearly demonstrates how we will get on track to meeting our climate targets. So that's another really big thing that's coming up next year. So yeah, please look out for those.
Thank you so much to both of you. We are out of time, but that was really, really interesting. And indeed, I'm echoing Becky's call for all of you in Scotland. Please make it to Edinburgh on the 9th of December. And Nathan, thank you very much. Are you going to be in Abu Dhabi, Nathan?
Yeah, I'll be at the COP, and you can follow the treaty initiative on all kinds of social media and also check out our website. Ian, if you permit me 1 minute to just say something else, which I think is
go ahead.
But I haven't mentioned because it's not strictly related to fossil fuels or indeed to the COP agenda. But this COP will obviously be taking place in a context in which there's an ongoing genocide in Gaza, an assault on Palestine. So that will definitely color the talks, even if it's not being discussed in the negotiations. And I think that is also going to really be a key issue for civil society and social movements, who are going to repeatedly and clearly issue the call for a ceasefire, for a true ceasefire, not a humanitarian pause or a breather before the bombing commences, but an actual ceasefire and for justice for Palestine. So that's going to be very live. I would watch out for that.
No, absolutely. Thanks. Very, very necessary to make that, to remind us of that. And I think there is going to be some overlap on the 9th of December in Edinburgh too, between the Global Day of Action and actions around Palestine. That's already been mentioned, I think, in some of the preparatory meetings. But thank you so much to both of you. I'm sorry we don't have any more time, but that's all we have time for this episode of Rising Clyde. I'm Ian Bruce in Glasgow. Until next time.